Gentlemen, as Team Trump enters its very, very high-octane lap of presidential elections, I'm joined by one of the most well-known Indian Americans who had a bid at the presidential race himself, Vivek Ramaswamy. Entrepreneur, man who's a Republican, a man who has an Indian identity that he's so proud of. Thank you very much, Vivek Ramaswamy, for joining me.
It's great to be here.
You're also an author.
Yes.
And you wear your Indian identity and your Hindu identity on your sleeves. Is that a little bit away from what Americans really find acceptable?
I don't think it's away from what Americans find acceptable. I do think that political advisors find it unadvisable. I've been advised many times that if I wanted to run for U.S. president as a Hindu, and I'm a practicing Hindu, then that would be a challenge. But my view is that you got to present to people who you are. You can't be dishonest about who you are and what you stand for. To the contrary, I think people actually reward that authenticity. So in the long run, I think the United States of America is religiously, racially the most tolerant, and I would say one of the most ambitiously inclusive countries in human history. And so I have confidence that the American electorate is going to be very open to people of backgrounds like mine, and I'm grateful for that in this country.
So let me ask you, at the beginning of this interview, we're in the middle of a very high-octane, polarized elections, almost like Indian elections back home, this American elections. And there have been two attempts at assassination of the presidential candidate, Donald Trump. How do you see these elections in terms of the campaign, in terms of the shrill conversations, narrative that's taking place?
So I see a big discrepancy because I've traveled this country extensively, obviously, over the last couple of years. There's a discrepancy between the everyday American versus the portrayals in the media. And I think that this country is actually not nearly as divided as the media would have you believe, or social media, or algorithms. Across the country, I would say 80+% of us share the same basic value set in common. Meritocracy, free speech. That's a big one in America, that you get to speak your mind as long as I get to in return. That's a distinctive and quintessentially American commitment that most Americans share in common. The idea that you may not agree on everything, but you still agree on the basic rules of the road. That's what I see in the country, traveling in roomfuls without cameras or social media algorithms. However, the narrative that has been created, and in part it's by the modern internet, in part it's by social media, that preys on division. Advertising dollars are greater when you have somebody click on a story that gives them an emotional anger, that's a quicker response. That amplifies, I think, a division that, at least in most of the country, isn't real. But there is a fringe minority, and the sad part is you brought up 2 assassination attempts in a period of 2 months. We haven't seen that in a generation in America. And so I do think that we are skating on thin ice, but I do think that we can also be stronger on the other side of it. And I hope that those 2 assassination attempts certainly were the worst of what we will see this election cycle. I'm still hopeful that we can unite this country. Frankly, that's why I ran for U.S. president. I do think that it is helpful to come from the outside of politics, especially from a different generation, to reach the next generation in this country who I believe is in some ways lost and hungry for identity. It's not that they're against what conservatives stand for or anything like that. It's that they're hungry to be part of something bigger than themselves. And yet today, so many people have lost their sense of pride in this country. And I think if there's one issue that's more important to me than any other, the economy is important, the border's important, all of these issues are important. But I think a foundational issue is a revival of that national identity and sense of national pride in the United States of America. And I think that's a big part of my mission, both during my own campaign and in what I do next as well.
So let me ask you, this identity, this idea of trying to be part of something bigger than oneself that you speak about, national pride that you speak about, these are some of the things that form the basis of, Narendra Modi's success as a politician, leading him up to the prime ministerial level over the last 3 elections. Commonality there is coincidental or value system based?
I think it's values based. I admire a number of leaders in other countries, and PM Modi is obviously high on that list of people who have taken pride in their own country. I think that's a good thing for a citizen of a nation to be grounded. We as human beings, we need to belong to something bigger than ourselves. Individual, family, nation, and God, I think, are more powerful as a message than race, gender, sexuality, and climate. Certainly, I'm speaking from a U.S. perspective, but those principles apply to other countries, too. I think people want to know, I'm a citizen of this nation. That means something to me. Not a nebulous global citizen vaguely fighting climate change somewhere. But here in the American context, a citizen of the United States of America, that I'm proud of that, that's grounded in ideals. I've gotten to know other world leaders in the last year as well. Take a leader like Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She's become something of a friend, somebody who revived Italian national identity. I think in the same way, Modi has been a successful leader in reviving that sense of Indian pride and self-confidence in India. I do think that's an important point, that self-confidence was missing. When I visited India in the 1990s, coming from America, there was a kind of inferiority complex, I'm speaking bluntly, but a psychological sense of inferiority. And I think that a great leader of a nation, not a good leader, but a great leader of a nation, can revive that sense of pride and conviction in oneself, in one's own identity, in one's nation's identity. But I'm looking at this from an American perspective, right? I'm American born, I'm American through and through. I'm proud of my Indian-American heritage and my Hindu faith, but I'm American. And I'm interested in looking at how we revive that shared sense of national identity in the United States of America. And the beauty of this country is it really is founded on a set of ideals that brought together a divided, religiously diverse, ethnically diverse people over the last 250 years. What are those ideals in the country today? Merit, free speech, self-governance, the rule of law. I think if we're being honest, we have lost some of those characteristics in America, but I don't think it has to stay that way. And my mission is to revive them in this country in whatever way I can.
You talk a lot about algorithms, and that's what you just said, social media algorithms. You know, is that a conspiracy theory, or is that something that is happening across the world? Do you think there was Chinese and Russian interference in the elections in the United States? How do you look at, social media, influencing elections itself, and the rhetoric that we've heard in recent times? And in that rhetoric, with the attempts at assassination of Donald Trump comes, sentences by Joe Biden, who said, let's get Donald Trump in the bullseye. Do you think some of these utterances have led to this very polarized narrative on social media? I
think there's something even deeper going on, which is a mental health crisis, both in this country and in the modern West and the modern world more generally. But what these social media algorithms do is they prey on those insecurities, right? They cause you to click on something more quickly than the other thing if it strikes an insecurity or generally a negative emotion in your heart. And so in some ways it's throwing kerosene on a fire, a mental health epidemic that's already burning, really turning that into a conflagration. So I do think that people who are most vulnerable, especially, are going to do things they otherwise wouldn't have done in an environment of social media really goading them on. I don't think it's made us more happy as Americans, or I think the same is probably true in India if I had to guess, but certainly in America, I don't think it's increased our quality of life. You could say it's increased efficiency, increased effectiveness of reaching mass numbers of people. I have a large social media following myself. I can more easily reach a lot of people, and there's a beautiful side of that. But I think on net, the way these algorithms work have really been preying on our psychological insecurities and frailties, especially in youth. So you got to draw a distinction here, because in adults, there's some things that have positives, some things that have negatives. One of the areas where I draw a distinction is I don't think kids under the age of 16 should be using AI-powered or algorithmically powered social media. When you're a fully formed adult and you're grounded, then you can deal with those risks. Just as we say for tobacco or alcohol or even for unhealthy foods of various kinds. As an adult, you're free to make your own choices. But I think kids aren't the same as adults. In some ways, protecting children in this domain is my core area of focus.
Let me ask you, freedom of speech on the one hand, on the other, statements by people like, let's say, Elon Musk, who owns X, or what was known as Twitter, and he says nobody's even attacking or trying to assassinate Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. Now, is that free speech? Is that conspiratorial? Is it...
So I'm not familiar with the specific statement you cited. I should say Elon has become a good friend over the course of the last couple of years. He's somebody who has created some of the most valuable companies on the planet, because what are companies valuable for? They provide something of great value at a lower cost than it takes for people to be willing to pay for them. I think that's a beautiful thing. He's also somebody who has been an unapologetic defender of free speech in America. Here's my definition of free speech, okay? What counts as free speech? Certainly in the American context. A threat is not free speech. Saying something that, engaging in fraud, commercial fraud, is not free speech. But here's what it is. The expression of any opinion is fair game. So there's no such thing as a wrong opinion. There may be a heinous opinion, but the right answer to that kind of bad speech or a heinous opinion is not less speech, it's more speech. And so I consider myself a free speech absolutist. But what does that mean? It means all opinions are fair game. And I think, personally, the path to truth, really, you can even think about this, hopefully will speak to many Indian Americans. It's an important part of the Hindu tradition, right? Satyam. It is grounded in the truth. What is the path to truth? In our civic sphere, in the normal everyday life, it runs through free speech and open debate. I think free speech is a precondition for peace, actually. Because if you tell people they can't speak, that's when they scream. If you tell people they can't scream, that's when they... And so I think that free speech is not just some liberal arts luxury. It's not some academic, theoretical ideal. It is very practical, both for preservation of peace and for our path to actually understanding what is true. I think we would have understood that COVID was originated in a lab in China much sooner if we had been allowed to say that COVID began in a lab in China. I think we would have reached the answers to a lot of much more difficult questions relating to the fact that many of these COVID policies didn't work, school lockdowns, et cetera. We would have gotten to the right answer sooner if we had been allowed to debate them. So that's why free speech is such a core value to me.
So Satya and Satyameva Jayate, as we say it in India, that truth always wins. But then it has to be truth and not misinformation, because a lot of that that is floating in social media is also misinformation. So how does anybody deal with that, especially in politically charged times like these?
So I personally don't believe, and I think history teaches us to be rightly skeptical of central determinations of truth. I think that we human beings, we're not God. We don't have a unilateral, no human being has a unilateral monopoly on deciding what is or isn't true. And so when the CEO of a social media company or a traditional media company or a government tries to decide what does or doesn't count as true, that's a failure of hubris. It is what I would call a fatal conceit, actually. And history teaches us that model might feel comfortable or convenient in the short run, but in the long run, it leads societies to do terrible things. And you can even look at the course of human history. Name one time in human history where the guys fighting to censor speech ended up being the good guys in the end. I'll wait, and I don't think we're going to find very many examples that fit that list.
And we can rest our case on that one. But let me ask you, Mr. Ramaswamy, are you worried about what will happen in November? There is a one-of-a-kind elections that we're seeing. President Joe Biden was in the running, and then halfway through Kamala Harris comes in, and now polls say what they say about the advantage to Kamala Harris. Are you worried about the Republican campaign being on the defensive?
Look, I think that we're going to be at our best if we offer our own vision of what we stand for. I think it's insufficient to just criticize the other side. You got to do some of that in politics, right? There's room for that. But that's insufficient to win. I think we can't just say this is what the left offers and we're against it. We have to go further, do more than that, and say this is what we actually stand for. This is what it means to be a Republican. This is what it means to be an American. I think people are hungry for that. And if we identify what our own values are, as I said, individual, family, nation, God, merit, free speech, the rule of law, and self-governance. If we say this is not what we're running from, but this is what we're running to, I think we will win this election handily. But I do think that we have a competitive race all the way through November. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't tell you, I'm not going to offer you a definitive prediction of what's going to happen. But I do believe the next 45 days are going to be pretty important for the future of the country.
So in the narrative of the Republicans?
Well, I think there's always room for, I mean, there's many gaps on the Democratic side, but I'm always a believer, even in my own life, in looking myself in the mirror and not resting on my laurels, but asking, how can we be better? How can we aspire to even greater? You know, there's the saying here, it's obviously very popular, and I'm enthusiastic supporter of making America great again. But I don't just want to make America great again. I want to make America greater than it has ever been. And I think that's what this country has been founded on, is this idea of the pursuit of excellence, right? We're not perfect. We've never been. As a country, as a party, it doesn't matter. We're human beings. We're fallen human beings after all. But we aspire towards perfection, to a more perfect union. And I think that that character of ambition to pursue how we can be better is what defines this country, and I think that that's something that it's a message I think people are really hungry for as well.
So we're looking, you know, we're living in times where there are two major wars that are happening across the world. On the one side is Russia-Ukraine, on the other, of course, what's going on in Gaza between the Palestinians and the Israelis. What do you think is the solution to this? There have been attempts made on both sides, especially in the Russia-Ukraine war. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was in New York just yesterday, a meeting with Zelensky, his third meeting with him. Do you think there is a breakthrough that can happen, and what's really the route for that?
So look, I believe that this war in Russia and Ukraine needs to come to an end and be resolved as soon as possible, end the bloodshed. I think that's actually in the self-interest of everybody involved. I think it's in the self-interest of Ukraine. I think it's in Russia's self-interest, and I think it's in the self-interest of the West either. Now, that doesn't mean that Putin just gets to have whatever he wants. I think we have to have a reasonable deal that achieves certain important objectives. I think one of the great threats from the West's perspective, and I think even from an Indian perspective, is the rise of the Russia-China alliance. I think that in ironic ways, this war has actually pushed Russia further into China's hands. So one of the things I'd like to see the West accomplish, including NATO and the United States, through this negotiation, I hope we get to that negotiation, is that as a condition for a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict, we require Russia to weaken or even end its military alliance with China. I think that leaves us stronger, and this has been done before, by the way. Last time around, it was during the Cold War, when the U.S. and Nixon led China to come out of Russia's hands. Back then it was Mao-led China out of the hands of the USSR, led by Brezhnev. That actually brought us to the near end of the Cold War. So I think today the world will be more stable. I think the United States would be better off. And I think there are strong arguments even for Russia to make the case that they would be better off, not being Xi Jinping's little brother in that relationship, but moving to a more trilateral relationship between the U.S., Russia, and China, rather than what's increasingly becoming a bilateral one.
But why would Russia do that with all the arms supply from the United States, from the NATO countries?
I think we need to rethink our relationship with Russia in big ways. I think that it should be on the table to reopen economic relations with Russia. That could be a big advantage for Russia, but they don't get that for free. I think that's got to come with completely abandoning joint military exercises with China. I'd like to see Russia exit its military presence in the Western Hemisphere, places like Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba. So I think that there's an opportunity for not a small deal, but a big deal, really resetting the alliances between Russia and China. I think we got to dissolve and weaken that diplomatically. And I think that we can strengthen much of the economic ties again between the West and Russia as a condition for Russia also really, I think, occupying a different geopolitical role than it has. And I think the Ukraine war provides a catalyst, or the end of the Ukraine war, I should say, provides a catalyst to bring us to hopefully not only peace there, but a more stable world order.
And where do you see India in all of this?
I think it is important. I think the relationship between India and China, between India and the United States, can be mutually beneficial vis-a-vis China. I think China presents a major threat to both India's security in the future, as well as the long-run security interests of the United States. The United States is really under a barrel is that many of our essential sectors, even our own military, our pharmaceutical supply chain, our industrial base supporting our military, depend on China for those essential parts of our way of life. It makes no sense from an American perspective that our own military should depend on China for our way of life or our own military. That doesn't make sense. So I think there could be opportunities when we think about production and trade relationships between the U.S. and India, where that could be mutually beneficial both to the U.S. and India and provide greater stability. I think a closer relationship and understanding, God forbid what happens in a China-Taiwan scenario in the future, knowing what side India falls on in that scenario, I think can actually prevent that conflict if that's clear from the outset. So I do think there's room to grow and build on the U.S.-India relationship. I say the same thing for Japan and South Korea and the U.S. relations there as well, to strengthen our respective positions vis-a-vis China. And, I think that there's a natural tie. I believe that every nation should look after its self-interest. But it is the world's largest democracy, and the United States is, I think, the world's shining example and oldest democracy that's lasted this long. And so there's natural basis for an allyship for historical reasons, I think, dating back to the latter half of the 20th century. That relationship isn't as strong as I believe it could be or should be, but the future is long, and I believe that there's opportunities to change that as well.
Let me ask you about the book that you just authored,
Sure.
Truth, the Future of America First. And, you say in the book, no doubt people were surprised to hear it from me. After all, one of the first things most voters knew about me was that I was not a Christian. Fewer of them knew that I'd been raised in the Vedanta tradition of the Hindu religion, which is far closer to Christianity than most people assume. Since childhood, I've been raised with the idea that there is one God from whom there are multiple different forms, not multiple gods. I would often be approached by people who didn't understand this, and I'd be attacked by other candidates, and you say the super PACs who saw my faith as a weakness. Are you talking in the context of Kamala Harris?
No, actually, it was in the context of the primary in which I ran. And so it was true, even in places like Iowa, where they had not really seen a Hindu candidate run for U.S. president on the Republican ticket. This was a real issue for me. And that's a beautiful thing, though, because it opened up dialogue about faith. Someone really gets to know you really well. And when I got those questions, in many ways, it actually even increased my own clarity and conviction in my own faith and my beliefs. The non-dualist tradition of Hindu thought and philosophy. My wife and I both are close students of Hindu theology, and I think it's deeply consistent with the American fabric as well. The idea that there's one true God. He puts us here for a purpose, that we have a duty, our dharma, to realize that true purpose. Those ideas are familiar to many Americans too. It's just that they may not have thought of those as Hindu ideas. Actually, the second president of the United States is John Adams. I'm a great admirer of him. He was actually a Sanskrit scholar after he left the White House. This is in the 1800s. And he actually wrote in a letter to Thomas Jefferson that if he was to live his life again, he would have become a Sanskrit scholar and a scholar of Hindu scripture first. And so I think that there are deeper ties between the great major world religions, between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, but also with Hinduism that I think go unexplored. And I think the beauty of the United States, and at its best, the beauty of India too, is these are countries that embrace tolerance of free exercise of religion. And, I think it was Gandhi who once famously said, I'm going to get the exact quote, maybe wrong, but I think it is the wish of every Hindu that more people become persons of faith in any of the major world religions. I think it's one of the things that really gets me excited about expressing my own faith, is that when somebody pursues Christian faith or Muslim faith or Jewish faith, I think that's a good thing, because the real issue and the threat I think we face right now is the rise of a new kind of secularism that is hostile to religion more generally. And so one of the things I say in that book, Truth, is the first chapter is God is real. And I say that many people may be in the U.S. surprised to hear that from me, because the dominant faith here is Christianity and I'm Hindu. But actually what we really share is the same value set in common. And the real hostility is the hostility towards faith and religion in the modern West. And the more we revive that faith in a higher power, I think the better off we're all going to be, both individuals, but also even towards that goal of uniting a country. That doesn't mean that people aren't free to be atheists. The beauty of this country is you're free to believe or not to believe. But I think in the United States, certainly today, the real suffering is, or the real risk isn't saying that you're atheist and people are going to come after you. That just doesn't happen in America. But if you say a religious person, particularly Christian in the U.S. today, that is a real risk for you. And so anyway, I think that those are some of the themes that I explore in this book, and I hope it takes positive steps.
That is the truth. And for Indians, many of them say Hinduism or Hindutva is the way of life. Vivek Ramaswamy, let me ask you, you're a Hindu by identity, Indian origins, but are you surprised by the fact that somebody like Kamala Harris, not quite, sometimes she's Indian, sometimes. What do you think about this entire issue coming up in the campaign?
That's her business, right? Every person is up to them to decide what version of themselves they want to present to the public. So I'm not going to criticize her for that. What I will criticize her for is embracing a philosophy of identity politics. That's part of her policy worldview. That your race, your gender, that these things are important, that we need quota systems in the United States in the form of affirmative action, race-conscious policies. I think that's divisive, and I think many of the reasons that there have been some controversy around her own, self-conception of identity, I think is in part because of her policies. They're so focused on identity politics in the first place. And I think part of the beauty of America at our best is that we're a country where, regardless of your skin color or your gender, you can achieve the maximum of your God-given potential without any government or system standing in your way. And I think that's an important, probably, debate in America, but probably one that speaks to other Western countries and even India as well. I'm a big believer in unbridled merit. And what does merit mean? Merit recognizes that not all of us have the same God-given gifts. In fact, no two people do. That's beauty, that's diversity. But a meritocracy is one where no matter what your God-given gifts are, you can achieve the maximum of your potential without any system standing in your way. And that's what I want to see revive in this country. And I think Kamala Harris and many of the policies she's supported are patently against that. That's where my difference is with her.
And what about the statements made by Donald Trump about immigrants, about the fact that immigrants in Springfield were having cats and dogs and their own pets? What does that do for you in terms of the freedom and, people like your parents who came and made a future for themselves and became part of America and the big American dream? How do you stand on that?
Well, look, I think there's a big distinction between illegal immigration into the country, which is really a border security issue, versus the separate policy question of legal immigration in the country. Donald Trump has been a hardliner. Frankly, I have been a hardliner on illegal immigration. I think a nation without borders is literally not a nation. India has an advantage in this regard. Many of its borders are with oceans, but it has land barriers on the north as well, and that's been a difficult issue, but mountainous borders to the north. For reasons that it may not be as present in the Indian context, in the American context, it's a big deal. The southern border is wide open. The northern border, you've actually seen even more illegal crossings. I think it's appropriate for Donald Trump to take a hard position on illegal entry into the United States. We're a nation founded on the rule of law. So I say this as the kid of legal immigrants to this country. That means your first act of entering this country cannot break the law, period. Now, there's a separate question of what type of legal immigrants would add value to America. And I think if you're going to add value to America and do it legally, then I do think that we are a country that has a great tradition of assimilating immigrants from countries around the world to make America stronger and more effective. We're not doing that well today. Right now, our immigration system sadly rewards those who are willing to be dishonest, to lie, to say they're coming for asylum or for refugee status, when in fact those aren't the reasons why they're coming. Instead, I'd like to see an immigration system that rewards those who are going to make the greatest contributions, those who are going to be able to be civic attached to the United States as well, share our national ideals, speak the language. I think those are actually the kinds of immigration policies we need in this country that we are missing today.
You still haven't commented on the cats and dogs.
Well, look, I say this because I prefer substance, right? The media has a field day with this. I don't blame you for this, but the American media has a field day with this where they will pick on one thing that Donald Trump says and make that the issue instead of the actual substance of the issue, which nobody's talking about. And in some ways, it's irresponsible, I think, to focus on one fringe aspect of a discussion while ignoring the actual main plot. If you want to go this direction, you could pick many things that Kamala Harris has said or Joe Biden has said and create a scandal out of that, too. I think we'd rather actually just confront the hard issue itself. What should the immigration policy of the United States be? My view is you can't enter illegally. If you're entering legally, you shouldn't be dependent on government assistance. You should be able to speak the language, English. You should be able to add value to the United States. Those are the criteria we need to use. Are we doing that today? No, we're not. Is there a possibility to change the system so we can? Yes, that possibility exists, and I think that Donald Trump is going to be the more likely candidate to do it.
And what would you say about someone like Ann Coulter, who you had invited on your podcast? And she said she will not vote for you because you are an Indian, despite her agreeing with most things that you stand for.
Yeah, well, I deeply disagree with that, and I found it initially to be angering. But my reaction is also, at least she was honest about it. I think there are many people who probably have that sentiment, who aren't willing to say it. And I do think, as I said earlier, to stay true to my own principles, I believe in free speech and open debate. And so I don't believe that those views should be silenced. I think we're better off when we air them and we're able to debate them. And the beauty of that is, by the end of that 1-hour conversation, I think I had moved her a little bit. And I think that that's what we're able to accomplish through open dialogue. When you don't, my first reaction was to be incensed at that. But my second reaction was to say, okay, let's actually have a conversation and be curious about the view. And I think by the end of the conversation, I think I had made a lot of progress with her as well. I see that with friends on the left as well. I go to college campuses where there will be people who think they vehemently disagree with me. One of the things that we did during my campaign is sometimes you'd have protesters at the event. My rule was, as long as they're going to be respectful and actually follow the rules, they get the mic, we'll hear them, but they have to sit down and listen to everybody else. One of the things we learned is actually half the battle is people just want to be heard. And if you give people a chance to be heard, it's amazing how you're able to change minds for the better. And I think that all of us, myself included, but I think the political class needs to get better at that. And if we're going to unite the country, that is going to be a key step in getting there.
Were you disappointed when you went into the presidency race and ultimately didn't quite work out this time? Were you disappointed personally? And are we looking at Vivek Ramaswamy doing this now in 2028?
So was I disappointed? I'm a human being. Of course I was. I set out to accomplish the goal of becoming the next U.S. president, and I didn't achieve that goal. There's a lot of factors I could blame. I could have a very long day of complaining about the media or the political process or the way the Republican Party functioned or the donor class. But one of the things I preach to my kids, and so I got to follow my own advice too, is that the number one factor that determines whether you achieve your goal is actually you. There are other factors that matter, but the number one factor is you. And so this has been a year for deep reflection. I think there are a lot of learnings from the campaign. Frankly, things that if I were to do it again, I would do differently and hopefully for the better. So it's a mixed feeling, because on one hand, at the time that I declared my candidacy for president, my polling was not 0%, it was 0.0%. And most people in this country didn't know my name, let alone could they pronounce it. And by the end of it, I had beaten multiple former and current senators, governors, a former vice president of the United States. I was, the top tier of candidates through the Iowa caucus, made it further than Kamala Harris did when she ran for president as well. And that is beautiful. It's possible in the United States, and I'm proud of our family for doing it together. So part of me is very proud of what we achieved, giving hope to people. I can't walk the streets of New York without taxi drivers, doormen, working class Americans really expressing their appreciation for even the message that we were able to spread. So that part of it I'm deeply proud of. On the other hand, I didn't accomplish the goal. I was in this to really save our country, revive our national identity, not just for the next 4 years, but for the next 400 years, I hope. I hope our longest and best days are still ahead of us. And that mission still guides me. And so whatever I do next, in the next few months, in the next few years, it's going to be to have the biggest possible impact on this country, and we'll see what the future holds in store.
Let me ask you, have you met with Indian Prime Minister Modi? You've spoken about him a few times. You observe him, and how would you, in Vivek Ramaswamy style, describe him?
Yeah, so I would love to meet him. I haven't met him yet. I've met with a number of other world leaders and prime ministers who have reached out to me during their visits to the United States. But I think the Indian ambassador had been in touch with our team, and I'm sure we'll meet at some point. So I'd welcome that opportunity. And should we visit India at some time in the next couple of years, I'm sure we'll have an occasion to do that. The way I describe him is he's somebody who doesn't apologize for what it means to be an Indian. He's the leader of India. He's a citizen of India. And he doesn't apologize for his pride in his country. And because of that, he gives pride to the other people who he leads. And I think that's an admirable quality. You know, do I know every one of his policies? Do I agree with 100% of his policies? Probably not 100%, just as I don't agree with 100% of Donald Trump's policies or anybody else. No two people would. But I respect that essential element of being proud of your country without having to apologize for it. I think it's something that India required, getting past its deficit of self-confidence. It's my view in India and how he's been, I think, a leader that, for all of his critics of what they may have to say, is somebody who at least is proud of his nation and will stand for that. My goal is to bring that level of pride and then some, right, to the United States of America at a moment where we lack our own national character here. I don't think it has to stay that way, and that's what I'm on a mission to do.
And do you think the profile of India as a country on the world stage, has it grown and over the past few years, and the reasons that you think are responsible for that?
I think it has grown, and I think the number one reason comes down to economics, GDP growth. India has had impressive GDP growth, led by the opening of markets. You know, India didn't have a track record of that in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, and it continues under Modi, embracing the idea that capitalism is still the best system we have to lift people up from poverty. I don't think that should be a controversial thing to say, though in some corridors it is. But I think that India has demonstrated that better than many countries. And I do think the fact that it is now the world's unambiguously most populous nation, after I think China's poor policy decision to have a one-child policy, I think it creates the opportunity for great productivity. You know, like any nation, it has its challenges. We have our challenges here in the United States. India has its own challenges too. But I think it is heading in the right direction. And I think, frankly, a stronger relationship with America will also be in India's best interest too. I think it's in the best interest of both countries, but I think it's in India's best interest too. You think about rebuilding the Indian military, you think about further modernizing the economy, further understanding now as a real player. You don't necessarily get treated with kid gloves in negotiations about trade. You know, you're going to now enter the big leagues. That's great. The United States would approach India accordingly, but in the long run, I think that's a good thing.
But if you look at trade, look at U.S.-China trade, look at India-U.S. trade, 1/3 probably of that. How do you change some of these economic decisions? Because it's all very well to say that India and China should do things together, but, there are the realities.
Yeah, look, I think there's room for great negotiation there, but I do think it's in the self-interest of both the United States and India vis-a-vis China to say that a stronger U.S.-India relationship is going to leave both the U.S. and India better off. Now, India can't just, free ride on the United States and say, oh, we're a developing nation anymore. We got to look at each other in a serious way and say what's in the self-interest of both countries. And do I think that there's a lot of room for win-wins there? I do. That's the way I look at it.
So just a rapid-fire round. Do you think, your book, Truths, talks about debunking claims that you are some kind of a conspiracy theorist and, your facts about 9/11, coronavirus, and even in D.C. at the Capitol. What do you think?
Well, look,
about
I think one of the titles of that chapter is Facts Are Not Conspiracies. They called me a conspiracy theorist when I said COVID began in a lab in China. Turns out it did. They called me a conspiracy theorist when I said that Biden would not be the nominee. At the time I said it, that was a wild idea. Now what do you see? Biden is not the nominee. So I believe in tracking incentives. I'm not always right in my predictions, but I believe following the incentives and following the facts and being bold to speak what others are unwilling to is often part of the path to truth. And that's part of the case I make in this book from my own personal experiences.
And the Capitol incident 4 years ago?
Look, I think the transparency is the way to go. The fact that the government was not initially as fully transparent as it later was, I think is just something that breeds mistrust. And so one of the cases I make in this book is just tell us the truth. I think in the short run, a government may find it to be in its advantage to hide the ball. In the long run, it's never the right answer. The way you actually build trust is tell people the truth, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. And I do think that that's something that not only the United States, other governments too, but the United States government has a lot of room for improvement and a track record that's been imperfect. But I'm also not somebody who looks to the past and flogs ourselves for being imperfect, but to say how can we be better in the future and learn from those mistakes of the past. And that's the spirit I try to channel in this book.
Thank you very much, Vivek Ramaswamy. It was a pleasure having you on Frankly Speaking, and a message for all Indians for who you are the poster boy back home, a message for the Indians.
Well, look, I spent a lot of my youth summers in southern India, and that was an important part of shaping who I am, and I'm proud of that heritage. I want to save this country, my country, the United States of America, and I'm wishing the best for India as well. Revive that pride in both of our countries, maybe even a stronger relationship, and I think that's going to be good for all of us.
And good vibes and good wishes coming to you, and hopefully we'll root for you in the 2028 presidential elections.
We'll see what the future holds in store, but thank you, and I'm confident at some point in the next couple of years we'll make a visit to India, and that I hope it's productive.
Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.